Give this a couple minutes before we get kicked off. What's going on up in Sebastopol, Al?
Rain.
Rain.
Yeah,
What's
it's
up?
nice. We could
What's
use
that?
it. It's nice. We could use it.
That's fair. We could use more snow out here. We're gonna be short on snow melt.
Yeah,
I'll
the
take
rain.
I'll take the rain.
You'll take the rain.
Yeah, it's been pouring out. It's been nice. It's, especially if since I've been sick. It's just easier to stay inside.
Cool. Looks like we're live. We'll give it like a minute or two just to let some people get into the event and then get things kicked off. But to your point, Peter, I'll take the snow. It's actually supposed to be snowing up here tomorrow through Sunday. Got like another foot coming in. Alex, I was going to mention to you, I don't know that you want to try to get out, but there's going to be at least 6 inches on Wednesday while you're here.
I'd be up for that. I would just have to rent my gear. I don't want to bring anything over.
That's fine. We can do a rental right in town. Just bring like your pants and jacket and stuff.
Right on.
Yeah, I think you should do that. All right, we'll give one more minute and then we'll get started. Thursday, almost halfway through March already.
Mike, how's it going? Good to see you on here, buddy.
All right. $10:03. I'm going to say let's get rolling here. All right, so welcome to our LinkedIn Live event today. We are going to be talking about tariffs, trade wars, and packaging, navigating uncertainty to stay competitive. Going to kick off with some introductions. We do want to get a little bit of a pulse check as well from those that are joining us today and some of the areas that are most pressing and biggest concern for them. The intent for today is very much to facilitate a discussion. We're here to host it. We've prepared some content that we think is of value to those that are attending, but by all means, we're happy to, we don't have an agenda that we have to follow. We have an agenda, but we don't have to follow it. So what's more important to us is that if you have thoughts, questions, concerns, we want to hear those. We want to learn from you and what your concerns are, and we want to speak to them directly. Just kick off with some introductions here. My name is Dustin Stearman. I've been in the packaging industry, was just sharing with the guys for 19 years. Spent the first 10 years heavily involved in the import and export of raw paper materials utilized to make packaging. So very familiar with the landscape in regards to tariff impact, how currency plays into sourcing as well. Going back 10 years ago, we used to see a lot of paper coming in from Europe just based off currency opportunities. Today, we're talking more about the tariffs that are being placed on various countries and how that impacts goods that are being brought into America, both from a raw materials perspective as well as from a finished goods or custom packaging perspective. Just a little bit more on my background. From 2017 to 2021, I built an all digital Mylar manufacturing business here in America. I fought against import, so very much stepped away from that. And then here in 2023, launched Vert, and with that have been focused again in import because we serve quite a few different clients who ultimately want to see cost benefit. And as we all know, there still is oftentimes large cost benefit from buying overseas or offshore, out of country. Alex, my co-founder, is here with us today. He has a different perspective on why he's built his supply chain solely through American and North American manufacturing partners, which I'm looking forward for him to speak to. Without further ado, I will turn over to Peter so he can do a little bit of intro on himself, and then Alex as well.
Yeah, great intro, Dustin. Peter Moore, the director of sales for Vert. I've been in the CPG space for the last close to 10 years, both with the natural and organic side of things in Boulder, and then transitioned to actually work with Dustin at that North American Mylar manufacturing space over the last 6 years. Joined Vert at the end of 2024. And the import side of things is brand new for me, and certainly excited to have the knowledge of both the domestic manufacturing side and the foundation, I would say, in that space, but also learning more and more about what we can do in the import market. Certainly excited to see everyone join in on the discussion today. It is top of mind in terms of what are people feeling within the industry? What are kind of the buzzwords around it? And it's certainly around tariffs and economic instability as well. So looking forward to learning from everyone and hearing everyone's viewpoints. But I'd like to intro in Alex, Vert's COO and co-founder.
Hey guys, my name's Alex Klein. My background is from the beverage and CPG side. So I spent a few years at Lagunitas Brewing Company and was their central point of contact for procurement and purchaser of all of their raw materials and packaging goods. So grains, hops, barley, etc., chemicals, and also all their packaging. So bottles, boxes, labels. And then most recently spent about 4 years at Cookies on the cannabis side. And that's when I got a little deeper into the overseas supply chain for cost savings, especially within the California market. So my experience around that, I've kind of been through the ups and downs of all the crazy things that happened, especially during COVID, and kind of forced my hand to play the game a little bit as far as domestic versus overseas supply chain, and ultimately landed in a really healthy place within Cookies at that time. And now here at Vert, part of the strategy that Dustin, Peter, and I are deploying is a full array of diversification within domestic and overseas, with a strong emphasis on domestic if our customers and clients are able to support it. But I'll pass it back over to you, Dustin.
Thanks, Alex. So real quick, going to go through what we've put together for an agenda, and then I want to open up with just a quick listener poll to see how we might pivot some of the discussion. But our intent for today is to speak about the current tariff landscape, and the growing concern, the severity of the trade war, what businesses need to prepare for in the short term versus medium term, how to strategically respond and stay competitive, and then just some closing thoughts in regards to like our outlook and view in the future of not just cannabis, but consumer packaged goods and trade uncertainty and how the supply chains will be impacted. So before diving in, love to just get some feedback here from those that are tuned in regards to like where are your biggest concerns today? Is it pricing? Is it running out of materials just due to supply chain and uncertainty with supply chain partners? Is it turn times, general uncertainty of just where we sit today, given the amount of news that we've seen and announcements made only to be semi-repealed? Or are there other concerns that you might have as relates to the packaging supply chain and global trade today? And please feel free to just drop those into a comment here on the LinkedIn chat if you have anything top of mind. We'll give that a couple minutes or a couple seconds before we carry on. All right.
If there's any other concerns that weren't listed on there, feel free to just plug them in.
All right. So as comments come in, we're happy to address them, but we'll keep it moving and start off with really just the overall landscape, right? As I was just speaking to, we've seen quite a bit of real uncertainty in regards to the impact of this escalating tariff landscape and some would call it a trade war, which is, I think, very much fair to say based on what we've observed here in the last couple of weeks. I think one area that we need to be really cognizant of is just looking at history and how it's impacted where we sit at the present moment. Pete, if you were to speak to just tariff increases, where do we sit at the present moment as it relates to what's been announced over the last couple of weeks?
I think, yeah, great tee up question. I think just general uncertainty. We're seeing tariffs come in, repealed tariffs going back on, repealing of those tariffs. So overall uncertainty. There's action being taken, and then certainly not following through. It does sound like more tariffs will certainly stick in the next little bit. Certainly something to keep a pulse check on as time goes on. I think a lot of that does revolve around current market and what we're seeing there as well. But things are going to happen. And I think for us as suppliers and business owners, brand owners, procurement directors, we just need to keep a very good pulse on potentially what is happening, and then set up contingency plans around the changing landscape. I think what we can take a look at is what happened during COVID, right? When there were actual supply chain shutdowns. And that's probably a worst case scenario for a lot of us. So let's take our learnings from that period and then apply it to today.
What do we know just in regards to the tariffs that have gone into effect here in March, right? What is factual versus the things that have been pulled back?
Yeah, we've got a hike on Chinese import, 10%, and then 25% on Mexican and Canadian manufactured goods. There's been additional tariffs added on to the Canadian side, and I think we'll touch a little bit about that later on, just based off of escalation. But that's where we stand today.
Appreciate that. If you talk, just thinking about what has gone into effect, what's your general opinion on whether or not they're here to stay?
I would say that the Chinese import and the import tariff, something that's likely going to stick around for the next couple of years. That additional price hike, it's something that we saw 7-8 years ago, and that has stuck around. So I would make a safe assumption saying that the additional import that we're seeing on Chinese goods will stay. I think the North American, the trade with Mexico and Canada, that could be the one that's changing more fluidly, I would say, based off of more of a structured 10% overall with the Chinese import.
Yeah, I think definitely for me, I would tend to agree. I think the 10% coming out of China is here to stay, just based on the last increases we saw are still largely in effect. I think that it's a little different, closer to home in regards to just, is there leverage that's being really swung around here in regards to larger outcomes that are being sought after, and it's hard to say. I don't have a best guess on whether or not we'll see these 25% tariffs stay in effect or not with Mexico and Canada. Alex, any thoughts for you on just the staying power here of what's recently been announced?
All I really have to base it off of is, last time it happened, which was COVID. And I think I'm looking at it more of not trying to speculate or really guess on what's happening, but just trying to prepare for the worst. So getting, my ducks in a row, or our ducks in a row with Vert, in a way that is going to protect us and our customers, in the event that it does stick around for the long term. I think it probably will be a few years, but I'd be lying if I said that I had all the information or knew that, or had a really strong feeling that it would stick around or go away.
Yeah, to your point, right? Like, I was really excited about the effort we were making in expanding supply chain into Mexico. I did not necessarily expect to see in November of last year the rumblings of potential tariffs being placed on Mexico. It was disappointing to see that, and I frustrating to see that, but it just kind of backs up, like, we're in this current state right now where there's a lot of fluidity in terms of movement. And for me, I think my bigger concerns are around like the severity of the trade war more so than just the percentage of tariff that's being placed right now. Like when we start to see the Premier of Ontario threatening to cut off oil supply to the United States, these are pretty significant actions or threats being made that really, have me wondering how severe could this get. And with that, I think that in general, the more challenging scenario here for people that are buying from overseas is if that severity of the trade war continues to escalate, it's not just a matter of a 10% hike on goods, the cost of goods. It's, can you get them? And that really brings about a whole other perspective that, I think is important for us to cover today. Just seeing here that Mike had commented that there appears to be right now challenges with businesses meeting delivery dates. So Mike, would love to cover that a little bit more in today. If you can share any further thoughts on if that's domestic or import. I do think that we could see, to your point, we could see a landslide of demand moving back to American-made production, which will definitely impact the serviceability of the factories that are here. On the flip side of that, I would say there's quite a bit of sufficient capacity. There was a lot of investment in the latter years of the pandemic that really hasn't necessarily been filled because the demand that shifted into North America while the global supply chain was disrupted did end up shifting back to overseas from a cost benefit perspective. So I do think there is sufficient capacity in the market. Got that. Thanks for sharing that, Mike. And I think to your point, like that is something that we could see increase to what I'm speaking to right now. Just going back to the severity of the trade war, Alex, like I'd love for you to share a little bit of your view on, import in general. And my understanding is you didn't face as much of the impact that some brands faced when you were operating supply chain at Cookies in 2020, 2021, when we saw the global supply chain completely come to a halt and brands couldn't get goods into the ports, let alone into their hands, and lost position on shelf because they ran out of packaging. How are you combating those times?
Yeah. Well, I mean, at the time, I guess my perspective is a little unique where when I originally came in, I was kind of taking over procurement for one of the VPs at the company who was just, wearing 20 different hats because it was a startup. There was only like 10 of us in the whole company. And it was simple at first because everything was brokered. And a lot of things were overseas, but I knew a lot of suppliers in the United States. So it was a relatively simple transition initially with getting things away from brokers and just pulling it into the United States directly with direct to suppliers. And I ended up having a conversation with our CFO at the time, or VP of Finance, whatever his title was at the time. And he had asked me about, how the pricing got so much lower because we went domestic. So there was a really good and healthy conversation between us because he was talking about our margins and how it was working so well, how we were getting things quicker. And ultimately, I shared my perspective with him, which was that I personally view the supply chain here in the United States as kind of the top tier. Because if we're only looking at pricing as the main variable, we're going to end up falling short somewhere else. So doing business overseas was really challenging, specifically in China, because one, simply just to be transparent or blunt, is the language barrier. That's one, and the time difference. So managing our supply chain overnight wasn't something I was really interested in. And we didn't have control over these things. Like, sure, I could have taken a trip out to China and visited these factories, but I decided to spend my time visiting multiple suppliers, A, B, and C supplier for any given item so that we were covered in the United States. So I got to see the factory myself, touch and feel was able to take videos of certain things, talk to the owners of the business, really understand how the business operates. Whereas I feel when you go overseas, it can be challenging to understand the full picture. Now that really depends on the relationships, because at this point, I do have relationships. We have relationships with overseas partners, and they are healthy and they are good. They're helping bridge gaps for language barrier and time constraints because they understand that's a challenge. But finding a partner and partners who do that is hard. It's taken years to build relationships to get to that place, and you build a level of trust. Um, so bef- Before I get too much on a tangent, overall, my perspective on the supply chain is pulling things in the United States. Overall, even though it might be a little more expensive, is less of a risk to the business because the service is better and the quality is more in our control because it's closer to home and we could literally go visit there. If I really need to take a flight somewhere today, I can probably go do that. Whereas if I need to go fly over to China, I'm less inclined to, do an overnight trip, and make that trip.
Yeah, you bring up an interesting point on quality. As I shared, right, I spent 5 years, going against import and really, pitching domestic made in America. But I will say that I do think the quality that comes in from overseas in terms of the QA and that process, I've actually been impressed by, Alex, over the last couple of years. I think, one of the greatest challenges that I see right now is that the moves being made to increase made in America goods could actually pose some real challenges for us here stateside in regards to labor. And from my own experience, I found a real challenge with buy-in from those making the goods to give it the proper attention it needs here stateside to ensure that the product going out the door is meeting the expectations of the supplier as well as the customer. And that is one area that I've surprisingly been swayed a bit by in some of the production overseas. I would say is it seems to be less challenges or issues from a QA perspective, at least what I've observed. Not to say that you haven't observed differently.
Yeah, and honestly, I think part of that is the cost, right? It's more expensive to do that because it's more time and it's more touch points. Whereas here in the United States, it's already more expensive for the raw material itself to produce the goods. And then if you have to, if you need human intervention to physically look at, I don't know, every box or every pallet that's going out of the facility, it costs money. So people are less inclined to do it. But at the end of the day, if you're delivering a really good product, that's the sort of service level that needs to be delivered. And even though it might cost a little bit of money on the front end, it's going to really save your ass on the back end, is my perspective on that.
I appreciate that. I think one other area to acknowledge, and I believe MJ Biz did a write up on this earlier in the week. They may have mentioned it, is we definitely are hearing of some of the Chinese production capacity being shifted to Malaysia as a way to offset some of the tariffs that are hitting. Sounds like vape hardware, it might be the first to really be set up and start being produced in that part of the world. But we've also heard some rumblings from our partners over in China in regards to tin production and other products being able to be shifted from a capacity standpoint. So it'll be interesting to see how that unfolds. And right now, we're seeing tariffs being placed on a lot of different countries of origin, more so than what we saw previously. So not sure how that might impact a country like Malaysia in due time. Peter, I'd love to talk a little bit about, really short-term and medium-term strategies preparing for these tariffs, right? So in the immediate, how are you thinking about the steps that should be taken right here, right now, as a buyer that is facing a 10% increase on cost of goods sold to their packaging COGS rather?
Yeah.
How would you be thinking about that?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think succeeding in the short term is certainly going to set you up for intermediate success and long-term success. So, if you have a strong base in this short term problem solving, you're going to be in a better spot next year, years down the road. I think in the short term, it's time to buy, right? If you are currently importing, you can continue to explore the import market. Like maybe if you're planning on placing an order in July, maybe do that sooner just to make sure that you got your goods on time and before any potential other tariffs come into effect. Like I don't want to sit here today and condone fear-based buying. I don't think that's a sustainable solution. But if you're planning on making a purchase, just make the purchase. And then obviously the second part of that is setting up your contingency plan around diversifying your supply chain. So if you're currently only focused on import, start spreading your wings, find some domestic partners that can help you out. I think something that we're going to touch on later on today is like the domestic side of manufacturing is not going to be untouched by the import tariffs, right? Like we're still, and Alex mentioned that like domestic manufacturing is still importing raw materials for production. That is going to get a price hike, so there aren't any areas where this isn't going to be unaffected or felt. So I think that the main thing is setting up that contingency plan in the short term, and then in the medium term, leverage that contingency plan, right? Find vendors that are going to work with you and for you to make sure that your products are being met.
Appreciate those thoughts. What, from more of a medium term perspective, what are some of the suggestions you might have there for operators and brands?
Yeah, and I think this is something that we saw heavily in COVID, right? We saw in the CPG side of things, we saw a slight halt in innovation to focus on the main velocity, the main SKUs, those hero SKUs that are the true revenue drivers for your business. So it may make sense to put more energy and resources into those SKUs and pump the brakes on launching innovation just to make sure that your margins are being met, right? And that may mean rolling back some of the plans that you had for growth, right? That may mean refocusing and reshifting perspective on core business and following the core business. That's where I would see things if current environment follows anything like COVID. That's where I would project both CPG and cannabis to kind of end up over the next couple of years. And that's coming off the back of a very strong Expo West in terms of new companies launching, new innovation coming on the shelves. But I think the tariffs and the uncertainty may put a slight halt into further innovation within the space.
Yeah, I read a post a few weeks back from, I think, CMO of Kana Gummies that, wasn't necessarily connecting this back to tariff impact per se, but really just the focus on the core business in 2025 and the health of the business, given just the ups, downs, the turbulent environment in markets out west. And I think that what you're speaking to coincides with that in regards to maybe the innovation not having as much of the focus and more just on the basics, right? Like you said, what generates cash.
And I think that goes hand in hand with awareness and forecasting. I know that's a big challenge within cannabis is forecasting, knowing what's in inventory, what's on the shelf, and what's getting sold. If operators can really focus in on that inventory and know where their products are going and when they're going, they're going to be in a better spot in terms of buying, right? And we're seeing that. We're seeing the operators that have a very strong hold on inventory are being more successful, are placing orders in a better cadence, and overall conducting business better.
Yeah, I think that point is definitely valid, but also market specific, right? Like depending on the market you're in, there's a lot of different dynamics. I will say that aligning yourself with agile supply chain partners and running more of an on-demand model is more prevalent than ever before. And with the market, CPG in general, but just, let's just talk about cannabis right now. I think it's really important to be in a position where you can not be carrying so much inventory and be able to get what you need when you need it. And yes, that does come with a cost, but I think that it's important to look at total cost of ownership, And really, just because you're paying more price per unit, how does that translate into other areas of the business, like opportunity cost of being out of stock, and that revenue that you lose, let's say, with maybe a shipment from overseas running behind. That revenue that you lose or that place on the shelf is much greater than paying a few cents more per unit for something where you can have it on demand, so long as your suppliers are meeting their promises, which, as Mike called out, might not always be the case. And that's where vetting multiple suppliers is really important, and having multiple suppliers is really that supplier diversity. Alex, I know you can share those a little bit more. I'd like for you to speak a little bit more on that, which is just really opportunities that come about from these challenges, and staying competitive during these times. What thoughts do you have for us there?
Yeah, I think you said it as opportunity. Like, I think there's a few different ways to look at what's happening in the world, and um, most of the time it's looked at as like it's a really bad thing. But I do think it's a really good opportunity. It's really helping businesses take a fine look at what's happening and get creative and be more transparent with their teams internally. Having the challenging conversation with your CFO and CEO and maybe your investors or anyone else, any other stakeholder that's involved in this, create some really healthy dialogue around the business. So from my past experience, that ended up creating more internal alignment for everyone that was involved. Um, when I think about packaging, I think of creative, marketing, and finance as the main people. Of course, sales too, but I think it does create some unique opportunities to look at the supply chain overall. Like in cannabis packaging, depending on what market you're in and what the license structure is, you might have, if you're not a vertical, you might have multiple different partners you're working with. You might have someone who's extracting for you, and then you might have a cultivator that you're buying flower from, and then you have a co-packer, then you have a distributor, and none of these are your own licenses. And when we go through challenges like this, it forces our hand to look at all those pieces of the equation and optimize where you can. And then by the time that the pricing does get better, assuming it will get better, then you did all your homework, and now hopefully your margins are better than they were, before you got into the mess. And I do truly believe that that is what makes businesses make or break it. It forces you to have healthy conversations with the relationships in your life, and in your business, and it makes those partnerships stronger. And ultimately, if you can figure out that puzzle, that's part of being in business, right? You have to like be a thought leader, and you have to have those conversations and go through. You have to ride the wave a little bit, and I think it's not an easy thing to do, but ultimately, it's going to make the business better at the end of the day.
What suggestions would you have from a price increase mitigation perspective, right? Like how can brands and operators be thinking outside of the box versus just taking a direct price increase to their current goods? What are some of the things they can be thinking about doing to offset that?
Yeah, I think sometimes there's a pill to swallow with, understanding that there's a sacrifice, and there's not always a sacrifice, but I think the best way to go into it is looking at it that way and start pulling levers where you can. So for example, with packaging, you know, in my experience, the creative teams love to make, packaging look amazing, right? That's what they're there to do. They're there to help make the brand look good, elevate the brand through the way that it looks and it feels and the culture. And you can do that with packaging. But there's often a discrepancy between how much creative and marketing want to do that versus what the business is willing to spend. And in packaging, that can show its face through embellishments. So, like, the nice shiny spot gloss or an emboss on the packaging, or going into a more rigid container like a tin instead of staying in a box or staying in a tube. And you can look at that in one of two ways. One, you could look at it as a true sacrifice and say, oh no, my brand won't look, as good as in one of these other form factors because it's less expensive. Or you can take it as a challenge and say, okay, how can we make this less, expensive piece of packaging or product better with, the creative assets that we have today?
Well, I think you can speak directly to that, right? You were part of the movement to making premium cannabis acceptable in a Mylar bag, which the industry in general thought that if it's in a Mylar bag, it's cheap, inferior product, right?
True. And I can't take credit for that. At the time, that was Burner. And what I did support on that with was the way that it felt. So the soft touch, right? That's the whole thing in the industry now where, depending on how deep you want to get on marketing with people, if it feels good, to the touch of your hand, you might have a different perception on the packaging itself and the product and the brand. And that was great. I think part of it was a really genius business move on his end, because we went from glass jars, which you're spending 50 to 60 to 70 cents on a jar plus the label, that's a few extra cents, and then you have to apply it, and then you have to ship these heavy jars in distribution, and then that's expensive, and then the jars take up more space on the shelf. So we ended up sacrificing that heavy feel, that premium, heavy glass feel, and moved into a Mylar bag. But then there was other levers to pull, right? Which was the film itself. It was like, okay, we're not spending $1 anymore on this packaging. We're spending maybe, 40 cents. And it's like, okay, well, now that we're in a different form factor, we can up the embellishments. We can pull every lever to make at least this one thing look and feel really, really good. And even when you do that on the less expensive one, it's still less expensive than the jar itself. So we were actually saving money at the end of the day, and it ended up feeling good, which kind of goes back to my point on it's an opportunity, right? Like all these things are an opportunity to be better. And sometimes you need a fire lit under you, like a tariff or some additional charge to help you look at the supply chain in a unique way that you have never looked at before.
Yeah, for lack of a better term, right, it becomes survival of the fittest, right? And I think that's what you're speaking to is like, these situations force us to be better. They force us to make hard decisions. I would add that from a, just mitigation strategies around price hikes, things to look at would be, production methods. How is your packaging being produced, right? We've seen that digital production in many cases can be a more cost-effective route versus conventional production, depending on, the goods, depending on the SKU complexity, depending on the quantities that you're buying. But I would highly encourage looking at production methods. One of the things that makes us unique is the fact that we have all production methods underneath one roof, both domestic, and then, coupled with overseas. So it's, seamless in terms of being able to really shop those alternatives inside of Vert. But, going back to it, another thing that I would call out is material selection. It's a time to really think about, can you down gauge on material thickness in order to offset some of the price increases that might be coming along, right? So you might be using an 18 or 20 point board. Chances are you could probably be in a 16 and you'd be just fine, and the consumer is not going to really notice all that much. And that could be a great way to, offset some of the impact there. Alex, you obviously called out just form factors is a huge one, major lever, but those are a couple of other additional things I would consider. In addition to, maybe there's, you see a lot in cannabis, it's very much community, right? There's a lot of markets that we go into that, we've been involved with over the years, where there's a level of competition, but there's also a level of like friendly competition. And it might be time to think about, looking at light demand and working to group buy a little bit, which is definitely something that, we're interested in supporting if others want to talk about that. I think it's the right time to think about that. And we've seen that, I know in Maine, for example, there's a group of hash makers that all pool their demand together and buy all their Myron jars on one order, and then they dole it out locally. So there are things like that that are happening already. It might be time to just look at it a little bit of a larger scale. And another thing that I think is really important to say here is that, from an opportunistic perspective, the brands that are, addressing this today are going to be best positioned for when the disruption and challenges do come. We saw that happen really during the pandemic more than anything else, where certain brands were on shelf, others couldn't get their product to shelf, maybe because of distribution relationships or because of raw material supply chain. And that could be from an ingredients perspective or packaging perspective. A lot of folks source ingredients from overseas. But having really this diversified supply chain today and vetted suppliers, in the coming months is going to set you up for the best success here 6 to 12 months from now, where you might be able to capitalize on opportunity at the retail level because other brands were a little bit later to address these challenges and felt more impact related to these challenges, specifically relating to keeping product on shelf. Or it might be related to costs. Maybe they're having to pass increases through, and you've taken the time to look at moving from a rigid container to a softer container. And because of that, you're able to keep price point competitive. And that's going to be felt here from the consumer spend perspective. So, again, these are real challenges. They're really not something that can necessarily be completely avoided. But if you look at them from, hey, let's control the controllables, they can be turned into significant opportunities. As Mike called out, if you have maybe 4 or 5 different products that are in similar packaging, but might be slightly different sized, ones, for example, maybe you have eighths and quarters, and, eighths and quarters have been in 2 different packaging formats. It might be time to think about putting them into one format and just figuring out from a branding perspective and design perspective how to indicate to the consumer that this is an eighth versus a quarter instead of size. And the reason for that, to Mike's point, is that you can aggregate that like size production to get a better price per unit versus having to order 3-4 different size products, and now you're not able to aggregate that in a production environment.
Yeah, and that could be for bags, it could be for boxes, it could be for labels, so that's just leveraging digital print, which is relatively new for the industry and really what has allowed young brands to flourish and grow so quickly, leveraging that digital print.
Agreed. I see Chris is just sharing some thoughts. Chris, which market are you in today? What part of the country are you on? Just speaking to the automated packaging machine, I know that there are folks that have set up some toll processing and contract packaging, at times even just solely the packaging, not the producing, to help offset some of that. So love to hear more thoughts there, Chris, when you're up for it. So I think just closing thoughts, and then, if there's other Q&A or other thoughts, questions, concerns that those here want to share, we'd love to hear that. But Peter, love to hear your view on, what's the future look like here over the next 3, 6, 12 months.
I would put a lot of effort into contingency planning, risk mitigation, and understanding the scope of your products. As mentioned, I think that having a keen understanding of hottest movers is going to allow you to lean into those SKUs and continue to weather the storm with whatever that brings. As I mentioned earlier, if you're planning on continuing to import, don't be shy, but also have some domestic suppliers ready and set up for you. And that could mean everything from getting pricing all the way to getting art files ready to go. Some suppliers are going to be hesitant to work with your art files before orders get going. Others are going to welcome that just to ensure that they can run as soon as you are ready. And that's something that we do here at Vert all the time.
What are your thoughts in regards to just the price impact, right? Like, this isn't just an import thing, is it?
No, this will be felt domestically. I also think that cannabis in particular runs a lot of stocked containers, right? So containers made in China, imported, and then warehoused in California or elsewhere. I think we're going to start to see a little squeeze on current stock on hand based off of what has been manufactured to date and what's been shipped over already. So again, careful planning, and then buy before you ultimately need it. You know, something that we hear in cannabis is, I need my packaging yesterday, of course, right? And many times we can deliver close to tomorrow, but any type of guidance on actual runway and product runway to keep your product on the shelf will be beneficial in this time. Price is going to go up, you know, and I think that's just the reality of where we're at in today's environment.
Yeah, I would say like there's a real importance right now to take and look at your demand and split it up, right? You know, whether it's if it's here stateside, it's a good time to also evaluate additional stateside suppliers. You know, we are going to see challenges with manufacturing base here in America. We see it with our own platform today. It's incredibly frustrating, and I would say that I expect it to become more challenging. Um, so that's one way to think about it, is domestic supplier diversity. But I would also encourage, you know, taking the steps to diversify if you're buying import, right? You know, keep 70% coming import, but 30% start moving it to a domestic channel, so that channel's set up. It already has your art files and colors approved. You know, proactively making the moves now will pay off major dividends downstream. I do think that, you know, we are going to see some turbulence. It's when you start to see price increases across the board, and you see capacity being moved, you know, not just cross country, but you know, or outside of you know, domestic production. There's dynamics there that really can throw things off a bit. And at the same time, like as you said, Peter, we can't operate in fear. You know, control the controllables, know what you're working with. It's a level playing field. Most people are going to be feeling this, and really, you know, just come out of this as Alex said, in a healthier position. Which I think oftentimes, you know, having been around, I got my career start in the financial crisis. It forced, you know, a lot of businesses that you know, unfortunately didn't make it through, but there were a lot that did, and it forced them to operate so much better. So I think we can look at this as an opportunity to just really optimize our businesses across the board.
Yeah, and I think you bring up a great point, and something that I see in the emerging cannabis space is energy and resources are at a premium for packaging buyers, right? It's hard. It takes a lot of time to onboard new resources and new vendors, but I think that time will be well spent over the next 6 months to ensure that you're set up. You know, we see that within CPG. We see that within large MSO cannabis buyers as well. They have larger teams. They're putting in more resources to ensure that their supply chain is rock solid. And it still takes them weeks, if not months, to change suppliers or vet suppliers. So emerging folks out there, I would say, put the time and the energy into it. It will pay off.
Agreed. Couple last points I'll make, and then we'll wrap up here. Unless I would encourage, if you're here, have questions, thoughts, please drop them in now. We have a little bit of a delay on our side to get those, so please share. But you know, one other area or two other areas to call out are really just, you know, expect the unexpected right now. There's going to be ongoing changes. We can already see that things will be announced that might not necessarily be upheld. Things will be announced that will be upheld. It's a time to really be mindful that we need to stay agile, flexible, and that you know, curveballs are going to come our way. And there's two ways to internalize that. You can allow it to create fear, or you can allow it to be turned around and said, I'm gonna own this challenge, and know that you're not alone in the challenges that you're facing in your roles. These are being faced, you know, across industries, across the country, and quite frankly, you know, I think it's starting to spread to across the globe with some of the discussions and statements and actions that are being taken. So it's also a good time to just surround yourself with other people in your roles, and have a group of people that you guys can knowledge share, and in a safe space, and share the challenges that you're working through. Chris, thanks for sharing that in regards to just seeing your clients diversifying. Well, appreciate everybody's time today. This was fun. Look forward to. I say this was fun as it relates to getting together with the community, not fun subject. But glad to get back online here on LinkedIn Live. And if you have any questions, thoughts, please don't hesitate to reach out. Appreciate everybody's time. See ya.
See ya.
Yes.